The beautiful palette that I'm duping today is a collab between Shellwe Makeup and Freya86. Freya86 is her Instagram handle. She makes gorgeous, gorgeous looks, so if you haven't already, you should definitely check her channel out. Now let's get started with the swatching. Of course, if you want to purchase the original palette, you should definitely support Freya, but I love duping and I learn new things about my own collection every time I attempt at duping palettes. Also, I'm on a no-buy, so I have a very strict budget for what I can and cannot purchase, and I definitely want to take advantage of some of the beauty created by other creators online. And swatching is also super fun. I'm also hoping that doing these swatches on camera is going to help you make better purchase decisions. Maybe you will identify dupes of shades you already own. Maybe you find new singles that you're interested in buying. Or maybe you just love looking at colorful things like me. So let's get started. For duping our first shade, I picked Perfect Storm, which is a light blue matte. It's a beautiful shade from Sydney Grace. In some photos of this palette, this shade is a little bit more minty green. I just used Sea Breeze and I also believe Seafoam from Sydney Grace in duping a few other palettes, Metamorph and Botanical. So I wanted this palette to be a little bit more blue, but you can use one of those if that is the shade you prefer. For our next shade, I chose Thunderbird, also from Sydney Grace. From the swatches available from this palette, this shade looks kind of blue. Of course, it depends on which swatch photo you're looking at. And Thunderbird also has an interesting purpley bluey sort of undertone, which is why I picked it. I love this shade. Next shade looks kind of sparkly and shifty, but it also looks very neutral and black gray. I personally didn't want to use something that looks like that because I don't use that kind of shade very often. So I opted for Milky Way, which I would say is the most neutrally and blacky gray toned multichrome that I have from Terra, and that is the one you're seeing. It has a very prominent gray undertone with the most diffused green to gold to pink glaze over it, and it has a lot of sparkles throughout. And this shade also has a lot of sparkles throughout from the photos. But if you really want to stay in the realm of sparkly black or sparkly gray or silver, I'm going to show you a couple of other alternatives that you can choose instead. But don't sleep on Milky Way. This is a beautiful shade. And what I love about it is that it has very prominent, tiny, sparkly red glitters throughout. I'm really hoping the camera's capturing that. I'm gonna move my hand slow to make sure the camera's capturing it. Milky Way was not your jam, Darkside might be. Darkside literally looks like it's sort of a black base with shiny silver glitters all over it. And it's a super glittery shade. This kind of a shade is ideal for holiday times. If Darkside or Milky Way didn't do it for you, Carbon might be the right choice for you. This is probably the sparkliest, or one of the sparkliest, silver shade from Terra. It literally looks like you have swatched a lot of silver particles on your hand. I do see a little bit of a taupe cast in the swatch. In the camera's viewfinder, there is no taupe cast when I'm looking at my hand. So just be aware of that. That is showing up on the camera. I don't know why. Beauties, I did an eye look with this palette in my last to buy or not to buy. The video is tagged below. For duping our next shade, I chose Northeaster, also from Sydney Grace. This is a gorgeous deep blue shade. You can see that I just received my Sydney Grace order because I've used a lot of my Sydney Grace singles for duping these. Because if you're new to duping palettes, I highly recommend Sydney Grace mattes. They are so pigmented, extremely pretty, and very high quality. For duping our next shade, I chose Lost, also from Sydney Grace. In some photos of the palette, this shade looks a little bit more warm toned, and there are other alternatives you can use if you want it to be more warm toned, but I actually wanted to keep the palette overall cool toned, which is why I chose Lost. I've mentioned before, it's difficult to know what the real shade in the palette looks like when you don't have the palette and when you're only using photos from online to dupe it, because different photos are usually enhanced and some are a little bit more warm toned, some are a little bit more cool toned. It's hard to know which photo is showing how the real shade is going to swatch like. It's very difficult to know from the photos of the site what this next shade exactly swatches like. I am going to put on the screen what swatch photo I used to kind of figure out what this shade should swatch like, and based on that photo, I picked Love Has No Bounds from Touch of Glam. On the single that I have, it says Love Has No Bounds, but on Touch of Glam's website, it says Love Knows No Bounds. So just saying that so that you can find this shade if you're interested in it. I love these super metallic multichromes from Touch of Glam. They're very unique. The shift of purple to sort of a magenta to teal is very obvious, and it looks like it has tiny sparkly glitters throughout. If you are at all interested in Touch of Glams, this collection is what I would highly recommend. Of course, these are a little pricey. You don't want to use something super multichromy. Multiverse from Terra is a good option. This shade literally looks like you've swatched glitters on your eyes. But again, beauties, we are never talking about unsafe glitters. I don't use unsafe glitters in this channel. So these are mica-based glitters, and they're so tiny and fine. And this shade is very pretty. I think you can easily see the blue to purple shift. It's not as shifty as the Touch of Glam shade, but it's very pretty. And it's so sparkly. It was very difficult to know what this next shade in the palette actually looks like. It looks like it's a pink to green to gold metallic multichrome with tiny magenta particles in it. This is the beautiful Veil Nebula from Terra, which has the magenta as well as the green, as well as the teal, as well as the gold shift, and hopefully the camera's capturing the tiny glitter particles throughout it, which is what makes this shade so exquisite, and I honestly could not wait to use it again, which is why I put it in this palette. For our next shade, I picked Brilliant Realm from Sydney Grace. Somehow I've never had luck when swatching this shade, but I think you all already know by now that matte swatches don't necessarily represent what a shade is going to look like on your eyes. Our next shade is also from Sydney Grace. This is There and Back. I have two options for this shade. The more gray option, which is this one, and There and Back also has a very tiny hint of lavender, which I absolutely love. It makes this a great shade when using it with the light or the deep blue, and even the mint if you choose the mint instead. And for the creamy option, I chose Drift, also from Sydney Grace. This is because I wanted my palette to be more cool toned. If you want it to be warm toned, you can pick a more sandy colored shade instead. And beauties, if you watch this far and you're enjoying these kinds of dupe videos, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribing if you're not subscribed already. For our last shade, I picked Crimson Eclipse as the first option. I'm going to show you two other options, but the reason I picked this shade was because in a lot of different photos, this shade actually was a little bit more magenta than purple. And then also because I picked a very purple option for the very first shifty shade in this palette. I didn't want to pick a shade that looked super similar to that shade. So if you don't have Crimson Eclipse, or it's not your jam, or if you want something a little bit more purple or a little more cool toned, Vela Supernova might be the option. This one has a much more purple instead of the magenta prominent shift, and then the green shift is also more prominent. And it's a beautiful shade, and similar to Crimson Eclipse, it looks like it has tiny glitters all over. Now, if neither Crimson Eclipse nor Vela Supernova worked for you and you wanted something a little more grungy, Hyperspace might be the option for you. This one has a very prominent gray base, as you can see, but then it has all the shifts of the other ones. The magenta shift going into a bronze, coral, gold, and then a very, very prominent green shift, more prominent than the other two shades. This is such a special shade if this is your kind of color. The shade in the palette from the swatches I've seen online looks like it has a very prominent magenta shift, which is why I picked these three options. Although in the photos of the palette, it looks very purple. Beauties, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give a thumbs up. Also write to me in the comments below if there are any specific palettes you want me to dupe for you all. I have a whole playlist for these dupe videos that is going to be recommended to you on the screen about now. I love you all. Have an amazing day, and until next time, bye.